we discuss integration testing with Spring Security. I will just start with what testing is, and then I will discuss a little bit on how to implement it. I will drive you through an example as well. So we'll be live coding together, and we'll be working on a very small example but relevant to what you want to learn. You have here chapter 20 just in front of you. I'm not going to read it through all the paragraphs and everything that I've done here. Is plenty of excellent stuff, but I will let you do that yourself. What I will do first is I will explain what kind of tests we have when we write integration tests with Spring Security. First of all, we do test the authentication, and secondly, we test the authorization part. And you can independently test these two features. So you can test either just the authentication or just the authorization. First of all, I'd like to discuss with you why is that needed. Why should you have the possibility to only test the authentication and then test the authorization rules separately? And the reason why you do that is because in general in an application you only have one, maybe two ways of authenticating, maybe three, but whatever. You don't have so many ways of authenticating in the same app. So usually you have some very limited number of ways to do the authentication. But when it comes to authorization, well, it may happen in applications that you have a different authorization rule for any different endpoint that you have in your application. Sometimes you have a group of endpoints that have the same authorization rules, but sometimes you might have so many authorization rules that you might even have a different kind of authorization rule for a specific endpoint. What you want to do is be able to simply just test an authorization rule without being needed to go through all the filter chain in your, say it's a Spring web application, through the authentication filter as well, and go through the authentication manager, go through the authentication provider, and so on and so forth. Basically, what you see in gray here on the diagram that I'm presenting you, which is the first thing I want to discuss, are the components from the basic class design, say authentication architecture, and in gray are the components that you don't touch when you implement an authorization test. So be very careful on authorization test. So that's what in most of the cases you implement when writing a test for Spring Security. So the authorization test is just testing for a specific use case that the authorization constraints are fulfilled by the application. And you want to be able to do that without going through the authentication. That's why everything related to authentication here in the Spring Security class design and diagram is great, because you don't go through them as all. So you don't go through the authentication filter, you don't touch the authentication manager, you don't touch any of the authentication providers you have, and in case you have an authentication based on users and passwords, then you don't touch neither the user detail service or the password encoder. So you only write specific tests for your authorization rules by skipping completely the authentication. That's one of the main important things to remember, because I've seen developers very confused, and I will show you an example why we will work on the code directly. In case you write a test, why, for example, if you have a user detail service, why can you actually use an user that is a mock outside completely of your user detail service? And sometimes developers are confused because they expect to see that in tests they need to use the same users they also have registered in the application. But that's not necessarily the case. It really depends on how you configure this. So if you want, I will show you, you can use the user detail service, but it's not mandatory. You can as well skip completely the authentication and go directly to the authorization. So directly test the authorization in this case, instead of going through any of the components that are part of the authentication. So to prove you that, I'd like to go to my IntelliJ. I have already created here a very small application. It's a very small one using Spring Security, where the only thing I'm doing is I'm exposing a hello endpoint, and I use a tiny configuration class to say that, first of all, I'm using HTTP basic because I want to be very plain with this example. And as you can see here, I'm only specifying that to access any of the endpoints of my application, you need to be authenticated. So I don't add any constraint, not yet, not for the moment, at least, on kind of authorities or roles that your users might have. And the users are defined in memory here because it's just an example we want to use. And I've only added a couple of users. I name here Bill and John. And you can see that that's for the moment not important, but in one of our next examples will be that the authorities here are different. So you can see here that read is the authority allocated to Bill, while write is an authority allocated to John. It's pretty simple. Theoretically, if I want to test this, let me actually try to restart it just to make sure that we have exactly this definition, because I'm not sure when I changed it just before starting the live if I managed to also restart it. So I want to restart it to make sure that what I've shown you here is precisely what we use. The application is started. I'm going to a Postman, and I will start a new tab in my Postman, and I'm going to call HTTP localhost 8080 hello. And if I'm trying to call it like this, then most probably I will get a 401 unauthorized because I didn't specify any user. And as you have seen from my configurations, I have specified that you need at least to be authenticated to call any endpoint of my application. So you also saw in my configuration that I'm using HTTP basics. So I'm just going to do precisely this, going into authorization tab of my Postman, select basic authentication, and then I will fill in the username and the password, which I have a Bill and a John. So John with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, suggested here directly from probably one of my previous examples in Postman, is also applicable here. So I should be able to use it to successfully call the endpoint perfectly. So now we tested it, but what about the integration tests? Well, now that you know this is your configuration and this is what you need to test, of course the next step is going to the test folder of your application, where we can write the integration and the unit tests. And what we will write is a few integration tests for our application, where we test the integration of our code with Spring Security. Maybe some of you are wondering why I refer to this as unit tests. This is another kind of misconception that I found in how developers think about tests, and they usually people tend to say that everything that's in here inside the test folder of your Maven project is a unit test, which is not necessarily true. So you might, of course, have only unit tests there. Well, you might have only integration tests there. The difference between a unit test and an integration test being that a unit test only tests piece of logic without having any dependency to that piece of logic. So you have, for example, if you test a method in a service, which is a component of your Spring application, then what you do, you eliminate all the dependencies of that service by using mocks. And we have different ways of implementing mocks for our tests, probably one of the most known dependency being Mockito. We will also use Mockito here, which is part of the convention of Spring Boot. But the idea is, anyway, doesn't really matter how you choose to implement your tests. If you want it to be a unit test, then you really need to test only one piece of logics, and then you have to exclude everything else. If you have any dependency, then you already can say you are writing an integration test. Well, by definition, integration tests are testing integration between at least two dependencies. So, for example, when I raise the Spring context, because I'm using Spring Boot test, the Spring Boot testing, then if I do raise the Spring context, then I can already say I'm writing an integration test. Why? Because I test the integration with Spring. I'm testing the integration with Spring maybe because I want to test the dependency injection and how it works in my application, or maybe I want to test any kind of aspect that I have implemented for my application. So that's why in our case, where we implement for Spring security tests, then we also call them integration tests, because what you do is not simply testing a piece of logic, you test a piece of logic and the way it is understood by Spring Security. So once you already bring Spring Security into the equation, then it means you are testing, you are doing integration testing. So that's why we call this integration tests. So of course, now I already have a class here and I have an empty test that I want to fill in. We want to write, in this case, some tests on the controller. So actually, I would like to say not on the controller, because in that case, you might understand that I'm testing the object. So I'm basically injecting the controller object here, but I won't do that. Usually, when we have endpoints and we want to test the security integration with the endpoints, then what we do is using something like mock MVC and sending directly requests to the endpoint itself. So that's why here I will do the same thing. I will just enable the configuration for mock MVC, and then I will inject the mock MVC object. So I will say auto configure mock MVC, and then I will be able to private mock MVC and whatever you'd like to call it. I call it usually mock MVC, but if you'd like to call it somehow else, then it's your choice. And I just add the auto-wired annotation above it. So add auto-wired to be sure I take this from the context. So now if you are asking why am I able to take this from a context when I never added it to the context, then the answer is very fast and quick. I'm using the magic of Spring Boot here. Only the fact that I added the auto configure mock MVC there is enough for us to use the mock MVC object and implement our tests. So now what do we do? Say mock MVC, and I want to perform a get call against the test endpoint, which is hello in my case, the same one I called from Postman a little bit earlier. So I say mock MVC perform get, so I perform a get operation, and between the parentheses of get, I of course need to add the /hello, and then I will test the status. And first of all, I will try to test to actually call it this way. I will try to add the user so that you can see that my test will initially be failing, and I expect the test would be failing because I don't have a user and I need a user. That's what the authorization rules I defined are specifying. So here I say and expect the status will be okay, which of course again it won't be. I'm importing the status method, I'm importing get. I'm not sure why is IntelliJ actually showing me that many classes. I will maybe do like this, import it myself, because this should be the request and probably this one is the class. Oh no, I took the wrong one, so not this one, but probably this one, the request builders. Okay, this seems to be it. And then of course we have to throw the exceptions from the method, because the perform method throws exception so we have to either try catch it or throw it away. So in this case, I'm just going to say add exception to method signature, and that should solve my problem. But of course, as you already know, so this will not necessarily solve a lot of problems because my test will be failing. So when I'm going to run it now, this should fail because we have an authorization rule and we use no authentication. So it's the same thing that happened when you first time used the Postman for the first call and you didn't specify a user. Then of course the response was 401. So in this case, you will see that the response status will be 401. If I'm going somewhere below in my console, somewhere in the response, you should see that I have a 401. So this is 401. So that's basically it. So what we can do is change this to be a real test. We'll say test unauthenticated hello endpoint. If you wish it just to be like this, and then you can say is unauthorized, which is status 401, but which if you read Spring Security in action, you know that even though the name is unauthorized, it actually refers usually to authentication. So in our case, the authentication fails, and it's clearly why, because as you spotted, we don't use any user for now. So that's why it's failing. So now, of course, that I'm testing with the right user, now that will be working. Okay, it's taking a little bit, I see, for the test to run. And now you can see here nice green, and that means that our test passed. But what do we do if we want to test the authentication is your next question, because that's what we were going to discuss today. So in case you want to test the authentication, then you need to make sure that this method uses it has a user when it actually calls the endpoint. So to do that, you can use one of the three ways in which you can define a user for the test. And maybe the easiest one is to use a mock user. So say with mock user, which is an annotation from Spring Security that, as I will tell you immediately, it allows you to define a mock security context, and from that mock security context, the authentication is used during the test, so that the test simply skips completely the authentication and only tests the authorization. So in our case, I can say, for example, Mary here. If I don't use any name, it will be the name user by default, but in this case I will simply put there a Mary just to show you what I said at the very beginning of my presentation, and that's you don't need to have one of the real users of your application. So using the with mock user annotation, you basically define a security context, and inside that security context a user, in our case named Mary, that is considered already to be authenticated. So with mock user is an annotation you use to test the authorization and not the authentication. And why is that very important? Because, well, if you don't know that and you believe that you've created a test and you are testing the authentication, then of course that's not right. So you might believe that you are doing something that's not the real case. So now observe that I simply copy pasted. It will fail again because I have a user, actually the status won't be unauthorized anymore. It will basically be okay. So when we wait a little bit for the test to complete, it will simply start the Spring context and everything else, and it will fail. And in this case it fails because we need to change the condition of the status to be okay, because of course you can't have expected to be unauthorized when you have actually used a proper user. So in this case we change it to is okay, like this, and then I will rerun my test. and make sure that indeed the test behaves correctly. So now we can actually see that the test behaves correctly depending on the user that we define. So that's basically precisely what we expect to see. Let's wait a little bit for the test to go. And then I will go back to chapter 20 of Spring Security in Action, and we'll discuss again on the other possibilities that you can use to mock this security context. So I want to be very sure that you understand what your choices are and when you use them. Because again, I've just shown you on code that you can use the with mock user annotation, but I'm not definitely sure that everybody really understands what's going on here. So the question that I always get in this case from my students when I teach this in a class is, how was I actually able, you see my test is passing now, so the status was okay, so how was I actually able to use a user called Mary when my user detail service here, it doesn't specify any user that's called Mary. So it's basically in our case either Bill or John. And I used Mary and it worked. So how is that possible? Well, because again, and going back to my Spring Security in Action chapter 20, you actually completely skip authentication when you use the with mock user. So that's the reason why you can use Mary or whatever name you'd like here, because what happens when you use the with mock user is that when the test starts, before the test starts, if the dependency for testing your Spring Security application is there and the annotation is above the test method, then what the application does is to create a mock security context. So see here I specified in the annotation this is a mock security context. It's created by the test and only used by the test, and inside this security context we have a mock user, the mock user whose name is Mary, and it didn't go through the authentication, so that's why you can actually use any name you'd like there. It's just a user you plug completely into the security context, and by that you consider somebody with that credentials really authenticated. So that's because in these kinds of tests you implement with Spring Security, you completely skip the authentication. So you just want a user there to be able to test the authorization. So in my case, what I tested is this condition. I'm going back to my IntelliJ, to the project config. Going down below, you will see that when I've overridden the configure method, this is on line 46 here, where you can see I specify that you only need to be authenticated. So what I do is I simply add in my security context a mock user, and that's just considered by my application the authenticated user. So that's basically everything I need, because now I can call the endpoint, and because I have a user in the security context, my application thinks that I did the authentication. So this is the prerequisite, creating the mock security context based on which we test only the authorization configuration. So that's what you need to be very careful